This is my Project 225 Quattro, and over the course of the past few episodes, we have been upgrading every aspect of the suspension. Our goal is to make this suspension as adjustable as possible, and consequently make the car handle as good as it possibly can. We're continuing this today, and turning our sights towards the front sway bar. Believe it or not, but there's actually not that much documentation for how to properly do this. The only concrete thing I could find for the 225 was a PDF from a different company's install for the front sway bar. At the end of the day, a sway bar is a sway bar, so I figured this was as good a place as any to start, hence I followed the guide and put the car on ramps. As you'll see through the course of this episode, I found out the hard way that their instructions are anything but perfect and leave a lot of room for improvement. As far as the front sway bar I decided to go with, I wanted to match my rear sway bar, which is also by H&R. This is the matching counterpart to my rear sway bar, which I already have installed, so it was the obvious choice. If you've already installed a rear sway bar on your car and you're thinking that a front sway bar is just as easy, let me stop you right there. The front sway bar, especially on a TT225, is leagues harder specifically because there is just so much more in the way. If you take a peek under the car, you'll see the stock sway bar sitting somewhere like this, and if you follow the path that the sway bar does, you'll notice that it is really wedged in there. Namely, it's between the subframe and the steering rack, meaning removing this isn't going to be like the rear where all we really had to worry about was the muffler. I don't want to give the impression that this job is impossible though. In fact, I was able to do it on a combination of ramps and jack stands just fine. The first thing I did was undo the end links on either side of the sway bar. Like I mentioned earlier, I was following instructions that I had found online, specifically another brand I found online. You can find them if you look hard enough. I 100% don't believe that their instructions are the easiest way you can do this. They say if you don't have a lift, you can do the entire thing on ramps, but I don't know if I agree with that. I'll explain more why later, but I suggest you do this whole first part on jack stands as opposed to ramps. What you see me doing here is undoing some of the transmission bolts for the dog bone mount. After this, I removed 4 of the bolts connecting the subframe to the actual frame of the car. The goal is to droop the subframe, not drop it completely because we're not detaching the control arms, we just want to pry it down enough so that we can slide the sway bar out the back. Just like the rear of the car, there are 2 brackets and bushings that connect the sway bar to the subframe itself. It's easier to reach these when the subframe is drooped slightly, but if you follow the method I suggest later, it'll be easy to get them if you just take the wheels off. The passenger bracket is simpler than the driver's side bracket because the driver's side bracket has an additional bolt you need to get from the top. This just holds a fluid line in place for the car. It's easy to get to if you remove the stock airbox. Here you can see me reaching down through the engine bay to get that bolt I was talking about. Now that all the bolts are out of the way, we can start to pry back on these brackets, and they should come out pretty easily. Now, according to those pesky instructions, after these brackets were off, you should technically be able to remove the sway bar. However, that is the first inaccuracy that they don't mention. This is nowhere near as straightforward as the rear sway bar. Apparently we're ready to take it out, so I'm going to do my very best to figure out how to do that. I made a terrible mistake thinking this would be easier than coilovers. Those I at least know the steps to. This is just a very interesting install. I mentioned earlier that this sway bar is tucked between the steering rack and the subframe. This goes to show you that some of the instructions you see online may not always be 100% accurate. My rule of thumb is to always find 2 or 3 sources whenever you're attempting a job you've never done before. Turns out, to remove the sway bar, another thing you have to do that the instructions completely glance over is remove the 4 bolts connected to the steering rack. If you don't, and you're on ramps, I really don't think you can rotate the sway bar enough to actually get it out. With these bolts removed, the sway bar comes right out the back. This is perfect, we're making good progress, and the sway bar actually came out. However, there's a big problem that these instructions don't really address. The subframe is responsible for holding all these suspension components and the engine in a proper orientation. Since the car is still supporting its own weight, everything is going to shift out of place, meaning you're going to have to use a huge amount of strength to push everything back and hold it in place when you bolt everything up.
That took literally forever. I don't recommend doing that. There's like no guides online.
Here are the two sway bars side by side, and you'll notice just how much thicker the new one is. It's also adjustable so we can configure the actual amount of tension it has. Sway bars connect two sides of an independent suspension in a corner. Depending on how they are set up on the car, they can reduce body roll, increase grip, and change the amount of force each wheel puts on the ground in a corner. They're adjustable so that they can set your car up for the best balance of whatever you really want them to do. Since they're so adjustable, I want the car to be neutral, so we're going to get the car suspension tuned at the end of all these mods. As you can see, installing this sway bar is really just as simple as putting it back in the way that you took it out, although it is slightly thicker, so it's going to be a little bit more difficult to get it into place. On the passenger side, there is a hardline bracket here that we need to rotate by 180 degrees to allow for the additional size of the sway bar. Here's where the problems that the instructions I was following really started to affect me. Since the car was supporting its own weight on ramps and the subframe was not actually bolted down, everything was shifted. You needed to use a jack and an immense amount of lateral force just to get everything lined up properly, with the hopes of getting the bolts into the proper hole again. So in other words, undoing the subframe on ramps is super easy. However, putting it back on is nearly impossible because the holes just don't line up and you're fighting the weight of the car. Here's where I got to thinking. We need to torque down all these bolts while the car is on ramps and at ride height. However, we don't need to line them up while the car is at ride height. So I swapped over to jack stands so that it was easier to align everything.
We are back at it. This is definitely not the weather to be doing this in. So if you're doing it on your car, I recommend you wait till it's not 106. I'm dumb and persistent.
As I was slowly making the realization that jack stands really would have been easier, I was also contemplating that I probably should have waited for a much cooler day. This was one of the hottest weekends we've had at this time of year where I live, so I really probably should have waited. I didn't though, so you get to watch me almost have heat stroke. The aftermarket sway bar comes with two different styles of bushings that you can use, and I used the ones that were most similar to OEM. Another downside to doing this with the car on ramps is that there's hardly any room and you have to be a hand contortionist to get these brackets back in place. And I'm not even going to begin to explain just how difficult it is to thread these, since you need to basically compress them with a lot of force to get the bolt to be able to thread in properly. In other words, I think jack stands would have been way easier from the start if you make sure to torque everything down afterwards at ride height on ramps. I fought with these brackets for a really long time and then eventually just decided to put the car on jack stands and do things the way that I knew would work better. Sometimes you really do need to just trust your gut instinct when you're working on something like this, even if it's not necessarily what the instructions say. At the end of the day, it's you doing the work and you're the one who gets to make the decision. And if you've come this far working on cars and your own projects, start having some faith in yourself. That's something I struggle with and I'm trying to get better at. As you can see, I put the car on jack stands, and now we can start to actually make progress in getting everything back in place. The main benefits of being on jack stands are twofold. One, we can reach those brackets really easily by just removing the wheels. The second of which is the subframe is pretty much hanging freely, so it takes hardly any force to move it back into place. This is great news, and it means we can just reinstall the steering rack and pretty much all the bolts with almost no effort. The main thing we need to remember though is we aren't torquing any of this down until the car is back on ramps. This is just to make sure that everything gets aligned and put back on properly. If I were to do this job again, or if I were to suggest how to do it to anyone who's going to attempt it, do it on jack stands, and then torque everything down on ramps at the end. You'll be saving yourself a ton of hassle doing it this way. Imagine trying to reach from under the car and compressing these brackets while threading in a bolt using as much pressure as a vice grip. Keep in mind the vice grip wouldn't actually fit if you had the wheel on still, so thankfully this method's working out great for me.
I can't even begin to tell you how excited I am that that bolt's in there. That's been probably 5 hours of attempting, and it was literally not working because my instructions were inaccurate. There's really only the one PDF of instructions I found, and I don't think that's the way you should do this going forward.
As you can tell by the way I started to slur my words there, I had been outside for entirely too long. I think it was about 104 in town, so laying under a car the whole day was not exactly probably the smartest way to spend the day. Once the passenger side bracket was on, I went ahead and started to put the end links in place. I specifically set the front sway bar at the loosest possible setting for the time being. Also, before you say anything, don't worry about the crusty end links.
Got adjustable end links on the way. Those I'm going to put on with the coilovers because they're just not here yet, and we won't need to adjust these because we're still at factory ride height. We want them adjustable when we throw on coilovers because when we drop the car, we want to be able to configure the preload on each of the sway bars to kind of play around with how much grip we have front and rear.
I then went ahead and did the same thing on the other side. I also made sure to reattach the ride height sensor on this side's control arm.
Believe it or not, we're done with this install other than we need to get the wheels back on and torque everything down. Every bolt we touch today, we need to torque down at ride height, so we actually need to put the car back on ramps. Ironic, I know. We're gonna get this car professionally suspension tuned, but I know one of the things they're gonna do already, so we might as well do it. We have adjustable sway bars front and rear, and when you have those on a car that likes to understeer from the factory, to make it more neutral, you can set the rear sway bar to the tightest possible setting and the front sway bar to the loosest possible setting.
You just saw me put the front sway bar at the loosest possible setting, so we're good to go there. My game plan from this point forward was as follows. First, I would put the wheels back on the car, torque those down, and get the car on ramps. Then I'd go ahead and torque down all the bolts we touched underneath the car, including the subframe and the sway bar. Once that was torqued down, I'd switch the ramps to the rear of the car and we'd change the rear sway bar to the stiffest possible setting. If only this went as planned. If you watched the latest S4 video, you'll know I've had some rough luck lately, and unfortunately today is no exception.
Back on ramps now. Yay.
Since my rear sway bar is also adjustable, to switch it to the stiffest setting, all I need to do is switch where the end links are hooked into the bar. The holes closest to the center and furthest from the edge are the stiffest setting, so that's what I was planning on putting them to. As I was doing this, one of my end links ended up breaking. Specifically, the ball joint wasn't actually attached to the end link, and it was literally held on with the rubber, so this was actually unfit to drive on. And you guessed it, that means we have to wait for the new end links before we can test drive.
Okay, what are the odds? Literally the last bolt that I had to touch, the bolt at the end of the rear sway bar end link, the ball joint in that end link broke. All of the time I spent out in the heat nearly getting heat stroke putting on the front sway bar, I can't even test drive it until the new end links get in next week. So, that's pretty funny. Oh well, I'm just glad that we got it on.
On the one hand, it entirely sucks that we can't test drive the sway bar setup we spent hours in the grueling sun putting on. But at the end of the day, we successfully installed the front sway bar on the Mark I TT, and that means that in the next episode, we are ready for coilovers. And of course, the adjustable end links. But the coilovers are the main boss. And honestly, these coilovers are going to affect the handling and the cosmetics of the car more than any other thing we've done to the suspension. So I could not be more excited for the next episode. And to make matters even better, the coilovers are already here. The only thing I'm waiting on currently is those pesky end links. I want to say thank you so very much for taking time out of your day to watch my video. The amount of support you guys have been giving me is honestly unreal, and it makes me so happy to hear you guys are liking these episodes as much as I am making them. As always, if you enjoyed the video, learned something, or just want to support me, consider dropping a like and subscribing for more. It's one of the best ways you can help support my channel. I truly do appreciate all the support you guys give me. thank you so very much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day.